Computer. Awesome. Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us on our frequently asked questions into Helminthic Therapy with Dr. William Parker. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Parker. I thought we'd just start by giving you the opportunity to introduce yourself and tell us what you're all about.
Thanks very much, Kyla. It's a pleasure to be here. As some of you know, I worked at Duke University for almost 28 years. We studied helminth therapy from the perspective of the people that are experimenting with it. So we we collected probably actually slightly over 1,000 different cases, compiled those, not counting the many cases that we collected from the web. So these are firsthand cases. We talked to a lot of medical doctors who are treating patients. We published a number of papers looking at the results that people were getting and with different helminths and different amounts of helminths and different regimens, different treating regimens. And I think we learned a lot doing that. So I'm happy to talk to you about whatever we've learned.
Amazing. So you're the guy in the know about self-treating with Helminthic Therapy.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I do have 10 questions that I've got for you here, and let's just get into it with the first one. So the first question is, what are the major risks associated with helminthic therapy? I know safety is obviously a paramount concern for a lot of people who are considering the therapy.
Well, of course, anytime you talk about the risk, you want to know what is the risk to benefit ratio. So for someone who has a life-threatening illness, then they're willing to take more risk than, say,
Mm,
someone who has some mild seasonal allergies.
mhm,
So the risk with helminthic therapy depend on the helminth.
mhm,
Then they depend on how much helminth someone takes, and they depend on the individual. So,
mhm,
and of course, you don't really know ahead of time how much helminth it takes to, say, cause an adverse reaction, make you very,
mhm,
very sick. Now, fortunately, helminths can easily be eliminated by anti-helminthic drugs. So if
mhm,
someone gets exposed to too many of them, now there are some exceptions. So and we'll talk about all the helminths as we go forward, but the
mhm,
HDC and the TSO are two helminths. That's the
mhm,
rat tapeworm and the porcine whipworm, and those helminths are in the body for such a short amount of time that they're going to be pretty much gone by the time that you could even get treated for
mhm,
anti-helminth therapy. But of course, the hookworm is one of the very popular worms.
mhm.
It's readily available, and that one,
And affordable.
if someone takes, yeah, it's affordable,
Mhm,
and of course, it's the most affordable.
mhm,
And that one, if you take too much, you can get very, very sick from that.
mhm.
So it and how much is too much depends on the individual,
Yeah.
and you can just get rid of those helminths using anti-helminthic drugs.
Mhm. So is the main concern with NA then just getting worm flu, or is there other complications that could happen from taking too many?
Well, you can get a lot of the same symptoms that you're trying to treat. So some people know that a mental fog, sort of a chronic
Hmm.
inflammatory state, can be treated with helminthic therapy, but too many HDCs can also produce its own kind of mental fog. It can even cause anemia.
Hmm.
There's a lot of problems with the we're talking about the Nicator americanus, the
Yeah,
hookworm.
yeah. So it's a problem with potential anemia if you take too many. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean anemia and mental fog and just
Hmm.
severe cramps and pain, just gastrointestinal pain, just an
Hmm.
incredible amount.
Hmm.
That's yeah, that's
But I,
pretty much, and you can even cause joint aches, muscle aches. Again, a lot of things that people are trying to treat with helminth therapy, that can cause such an inflammatory state if you get too many that it can be a very bad scenario. Now, of course, that's not typical,
hmm.
and most
Hmm.
people use a fairly low dose that won't have those kinds of effects.
Totally. That's been my experience. I actually have had severe anemia for a very long time. And my anemia, I still have it, but it is slightly better since I started hookworm therapy. I think because I'm absorbing more nutrition from my food. But I'd also, in regards to brain fog, my brain fog is significantly better. But I actually think it's because I'm off of medications now. I had brain fog from the IBD medications that I was on for sure. So that's a very good, concise answer. Thank you. I think that obviously the major concern with helminths is that obviously you just take too many and that you don't do the dosing correctly and that you're not educated about how to do the therapy yourself. Correct?
Right. Yeah. When people do the dosing the ideal way, and I'll talk
Hmm.
about in an ideal world a lot.
Hmm.
An ideal way is that you start out a low dose and you slowly work your way up. But
Hmm.
if someone is having trouble accessing helminths and they can only get one or two shipments,
Hmm.
or if they have a disease that is very debilitating, they don't necessarily have months and months to
Yeah.
adjust their dose. So a lot
Hmm.
of people, from based on the studies that we've done, you can tell that a lot of people are just taking a shot and just taking a shot
Yeah.
at some level. It would probably work, and then sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it does, and then
Hmm.
sometimes it's too much.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we're going to get into some of those things like dosing and species selection in a couple of questions. But my next question for you is one that I know is maybe sometimes a little bit difficult to answer, but how effective is Helminthic therapy?
So helminthc therapy has a range of effectiveness, and it depends on what the condition is generally.
Hmm. Hmm.
When you're talking about effective, you're talking about an average, say 100 people take the therapy,
Hmm.
how many of them experience a beneficial effect. So for
Hmm.
example, with autism, it's something we've looked at with kids that have not just the mental issues associated with autism with social awareness because it doesn't helmets don't affect those, but they can have other kinds of inflammatory conditions, GI conditions, mental
Yeah.
fog, anxiety, depression, all these other conditions that people use helminthic therapy for. Kids with autism tend to be treated fairly effectively, maybe 70% or more. Again, it doesn't cure
Wow.
autism, but it
Hmm.
can help their inflammatory conditions. If you look
Hmm.
at seasonal allergies, almost 100%. If you look at relapsing
Wow.
remitted multiple sclerosis, almost 100%. But then if you look at, say, inflammatory bowel disease, which a lot of
Hmm.
folks are interested in, it can be 40 to 60%,
Hmm.
and you look at say a progressive autoimmune condition.
Hmm.
Once sclerosis has progressed,
Hmm.
then the treatment effectiveness might drop. And so
So it's
relapsing
better to,
remitting, yeah,
oh, sorry, it's better to get in early if you do have that type of autoimmune disease. Is that correct?
right. And that's true, say, for example, with alopecia. So you got an autoimmune condition, you get it early, and the helminth therapy appears to be more effective than if you wait until very
Interesting.
late in the progression of the condition.
Interesting. That does make sense, I guess. So obviously it depends how effective helminths are going to be on which species you're using and how far along your disease is. Is that pretty much the gist of it?
Well, so the question about the disease, or so the question about the helminth and the disease pairing,
Yeah.
right? So we know
Hmm.
that some diseases, for example, lung conditions, might be best treated with the hookworm.
Hmm.
But in general, we
Hmm.
don't have solid evidence that says one helminth is better than another. So, for
Yeah.
example, TSO and HDC versus the hookworm, we don't really know if one is fundamentally more effective. Now, we know the hookworm has more side effects, but we also know that with the TSO, it's much more expensive, and with the HDC, it's not commercial. Well, it is commercially available now, but it's also expensive, or
It
you
is.
can manufacture yourself,
Hmm.
which is very, very time consuming.
Hmm.
So yeah, so we don't, that's a great question. People think, well, one worm must be better than the other. And they probably are right, but these worms are really different just in terms of their biology and their
Mm.
history,
Mm.
but we don't know if one is better than the other. The way it looks may be just if your body's sort of missing any worm. And
Yeah.
if you just get some worm, it fills that what we call a niche space in biology. It
Hmm.
fills that niche space, and then that's what your body needs. It's sort of if you're missing exercise and you get exercise, it doesn't matter if
Yeah.
you're swimming, if you're running,
Mm.
or lifting weights. It's just it gives you the exercise your body needs.
Interesting. Yeah, it's going to work out your immune system in some way or another, right?
That's the idea. In
Hmm.
certain ways that bacteria don't do and
Yeah.
yeast don't do. The helminths are doing things that none of those other symbiotic organisms can do.
Interesting. Well, that actually is a great segue to my next question, which is Why do humans need helminths? Why does this therapy matter? Why does it make a difference?
Well, I think Moises Velasquez Manoff, that's a mouthful, but that's his
Hmm.
name. He wrote a great book about the why we need helmets, and he used an analogy. As a species, we've sort of always been leaning into this wind. Our immune system has been leaning into this wind of symbiotic organisms, and suddenly you take it away, and then our immune system falls over. And
Hmm.
that's a really good analogy. You've got an immune system that's there, and it's designed to interact with these organisms that are everywhere in the environment until suddenly we invent, running water
Yeah.
and toilets and plastic to store our food in, and houses where in my house I never contact the dirt, right?
Hmm.
Unless my wife brings a flower into the house.
Hmm.
But then it's a minuscule amount. So I never encounter naturally a helmet. So then it kind of it just leaves a space where my
Yeah.
immune system has a lot of things in it with
Mm.
nothing to do. And those things with nothing to do,
Mm.
that's where the problem is.
Interesting. And is that kind of what creates an overactive immune system because it essentially has nothing to focus on?
Yeah, it's sort of we think of it as we use the bored teenager analogy a lot. If you don't give a teenager something to do, they're going to find something bad to do. So, I mean, that's kind of it, really. It's
That is
you've
kind of
got
what
these.
chronic illness is like.
Yeah, your immune system is doing something naughty because it didn't have anything reasonable to do. That's really a
Mm.
lot of it. And you know, we've done this experiment on ourselves by
Hmm.
completely cleaning up our environment, getting, for example, if you think about the HDC, right? We would have
Hmm.
had contact with that organism if rodents would have been able to get into our food
Hmm.
and yep, and
Hmm.
insects, then we would have
Yeah.
had contact. But rodents and insects can't get into my food now because
No,
it's
doesn't
all
happen.
yeah, it's in a refrigerator, it's in a cabinet, in a can.
Mhm.
They just can't do it. And that's a good
Mm.
example.
Mm. So basically, we're no longer interacting with helminths in a natural way. And so we essentially have to give them to ourselves.
Yeah, we are helminth deficient.
Mm.
David Barker was the man who coined the term hygiene hypothesis. Now,
Yeah.
back in the back in the 1970s,
Hmm.
we knew, I say we scientists knew that it was a helminth deficiency that was the problem.
Hmm.
That was Brian Greenwood in 1968 that figured that out. So, but then in the late 1980s, this this British scientist named Brian Barker came along and figured out, hey, it's when you get running water in your house,
Hmm.
then you tend to get appendicitis. So appendicitis is one of those things, and he coined the term
Interesting.
hygiene hypothesis. And what he thought, and I had the pleasure of talking to him before he passed
Hmm.
away, and he said, "Look, I think it's the hot water heaters." Which it
Ah.
kind of, if you think about that, like why would it be the hot water heaters? But before the time of hot water heaters, hot water was
Mm.
not a utility; it was a commodity. You had to carry
Yeah.
wood, you had to light a fire, you had to
Hmm.
carry the water.
Hmm.
You just didn't stick your dirty hands into the hot water because it was a lot of work to get.
Yeah.
So whereas
Hmm.
now we just turn on a spigot and there's your hot water, you can clean your hands. So and, our use of soap
Mm.
is a good example of how we prevent transmission of a hookworm, for
Hmm.
example, right?
Hmm.
You know, so
And
that's one way.
all of this essentially has decreased our gut ecosystem diversity because we're no longer interacting with all those species anymore, right?
That is exactly correct. Yes.
Wow. I mean, it's so interesting. It's so interesting, especially in regards to the hygiene hypothesis and how, well, something that does definitely provide benefits. Being hygienic has its benefits, but there are definitely drawbacks. It's like a sliding scale. Like we've gone past the point where hygiene is good, and we are starting to get into the point where it's getting too much and it's actually causing some health issues.
Well, so the way that we look at it in the scientific literature, when I write a paper and I work with other immunologists, is we look at it sort of like there's certain aspects of hygiene that we got to have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't
Mm-hmm.
want cholera, typhoid, amoebic
No.
dysentery everywhere. That is bad. That will kill everybody. But so
Mm-hmm.
we have to have these things in place.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, because we live in a very crowded world, living in
Yeah.
cities, so it's just absolutely necessary to have these things in place. So it's not, I don't think it's, the way that we look at it is not that we've gone too far with something, is that we've done what was necessary, but we need to compensate for the
Mm,
kickback, basically.
that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. That's a good way of looking at it. And it also allows us to not have to focus on, oh, we need to change society. We need to go outside and walk in the dirt. We need to touch pigs and touch rats. That's not really what the therapy is about. It's essentially living our life as we are in modern society, but just reintroducing the specific species that are missing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it probably would work if you were a farmer. You still
Mm-hmm.
have good, you have, but you have hands-on with your farm animals because you'd still probably get exposed to the kind of things. And maybe we see this in certain groups in the United States that do live in a very traditional lifestyle, but
Mm-hmm.
yet can avoid cholera and amoebic dysentery and typhoid by having appropriate sanitation. So
Yeah.
it's possible, but that's not practical for everyone, right? You know, everybody can't move to a farm and start living with farm animals. That doesn't work.
It's definitely not practical for me. That's for sure. Okay, so we've touched on the species that are used in helminthic therapy. There are four species that are used. So I was just wondering if you could tell us the main benefits and the main drawbacks of each of the four species.
Okay, so let's start with we'll start with the easiest one first,
Mm-hmm.
which is the human whipworm. So
Mm-hmm.
it's also known as TTO, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not used by a lot of people. It's expensive. It's hard to get, um,
Mm-hmm.
and it can make some conditions worse. Now it can work great. There's Ping Loke is a professor here in the U.S. that does a lot of work in particular monitoring one individual who's has inflammatory bowel disease, and that person is definitely well treated with the
Mm-hmm.
TTO. So it can work, but at the same time, people that are involved with helminths therapy don't really like to use it a lot because
Mm-hmm.
it can make things worse.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to get and hard to manufacture.
It's definitely
So
the species that's the seems to be the least widely used from what I've seen. TTO.
it is, I believe that is still the case. It's the least widely used. So
Mm-hmm.
then the cousin, which is TSO, that's the
Mm-hmm.
porcine whipworm. Now
Mm-hmm.
that one is fairly popular. There's one supplier that produces it.
Mm-hmm.
It is expensive. It can be
Mm-hmm.
expensive. It
Mm-hmm.
it has the same effectiveness as the next one I'll talk about, which is the HDC.
Mm-hmm.
It might take a little bit longer to kick in. It keeps failing in clinical trials, which is that
TSO.
is yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the TSO. That is a
Mm-hmm.
problem for the
Mm-hmm.
field. As me as a scientist, my goal is to get this out to everybody. And
Totally.
because we know so much about how it works, we can kind of tell ahead of time whether or not a trial is going to fail or not. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times we see, okay, they've set this one up for failure and it's not going to
Yeah.
be, um,
Yeah.
that's a problem. And that's a big problem. We would love to run some clinical trials, but we would do it much differently than the way that they've been done in the past. And we probably wouldn't use the TSO either,
Mm-hmm.
just because it does take a little bit longer to kick in
Mm-hmm.
and start working.
So just by comparing the four species, we have TTO, which is not really widely used because it make some conditions worse, but it is effective in some cases. Then we have TSO, which is effective, doesn't seem to perform well in clinical trials for a variety of reasons that we will probably touch on later. Um, and it is widely available, TSO. Correct. So the next species is NA.
Well, let's do the HDC next because it
Okay.
basically has the same effects as the TSO.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be harder for a lot of people to get. It can even be more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible to manufacture. It's not possible. You got to have a pig farm and a centrifuge. You got to have a lot of stuff to manufacture
Yeah,
TSO.
wow.
TTO can be produced, but it's hard. Whereas the HDC can be produced on your own, but it's very time consuming
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
similar to the TSO, both the HDC and the TSO. And I'm just using a lot of letters right now. But those
Yeah.
two organisms, and I apologize for that, but those two organisms can be manufactured in such a way they don't work. So the
Okay.
manufacturing is really important
Mm-hmm.
and the person that produces the TSO, the consensus is that that person the one that's it's available on the market knows how
Hmm.
to produce it. And the same is
Hmm.
true with there's a couple of people producing the HDCs, but when you try to produce those things on your own, it can be more
Yeah.
challenging.
Mm.
But again, similar effects, really good for seasonal allergies, really good for relapsing remitting autoimmune issues, extremely good for neuropsychiatric stuff, mental fog, major
Mm.
depressive disorder, and all five types of anxiety disorders.
That's HTC you're
The
talking about?
and the TSO, yes.
And TSO. Okay, so oh, interesting. But HTC is more difficult to get globally. As far as I understand, you can't get it here in Australia, um,
Right.
which is unfortunate. Hopefully that will change, although I don't think so. um, but
We're
yeah,
going to try to change it. We will
yes,
try.
yeah, we will try for sure, for sure. That's the goal is to make this available to the people who want to use it, essentially. Um, so HTC does also work fairly quickly too. That's one of the major benefits of it. Is that true?
Yeah, it works very quickly within a week. So you'll know,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can. So it's easy to. Generally, the idea behind figuring out what your dose is, you start low and you move
Mm-hmm.
slowly up, and
Mm-hmm.
that can work pretty well with the TSO or with the HDC. With the
Mm-hmm.
next organism we're going to talk about, not so much because you have to wait a long time to really know if you've gotten the dose right.
Yeah.
So that's the
Mm-hmm.
idea, and as you pointed out, if you're having trouble getting the HDC, then you have to
Mm-hmm.
go with a different worm.
Because it also doesn't transport very easily, correct? So if your supplier is not very close or it's not very reliable, that means your dose is going to be much less effective. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't, the transportation issues with that organism have not been worked out.
Yeah.
And that's not something that, myself working at this from a clinical trial perspective,
Mm-hmm.
it's not
Mm-hmm.
something we would try to do
Yeah.
because, with FDA approval, we can deliver it right to the hospital and run the clinical
Yeah.
trial without any trouble. So we're not, that'll be something for somebody, a
Mm-hmm.
scientist after me
Mm-hmm.
to, or hopefully me later down the road to try to help to figure that
Yeah, that's exciting. And the last species, of course, is NA.
out. Right, the NA, yeah,
Hmm.
the old hookworm. So,
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows a hookworm can be really bad.
Hmm.
I think the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States is a just giant foundation which was formed to get rid of the hookworm because it was such a problem in the southern United States. So yeah, but if you control the dose, keep the dose low,
Hmm.
and back to what we said earlier, it can be tricky because if you have to wait 3 months and then,
Yeah.
the hookworm goes through a cycle, it doesn't reach maturity for a while in the human
Yeah.
body. If you have to wait 2 or 3 months before you know if you have enough or not, it can take a long time to
Mm.
slowly raise your dose up to a reasonable amount. Say with
Mm.
a HDC, you might adjust the dose 6 or 7 times before you
Yeah.
find something is good for you. But if you try to do that with the NA, the hookworm, it could take a couple of years, which some
Yeah.
people just don't have that kind of time.
Yeah. Sure. Especially a lot of the people who are considering helminths for a therapy. Um, so my understanding is the major drawback of NA is that obviously you can overdose if you take too many, and that it does take so long to show any sort of benefits. Like I didn't see any benefits on NA until after 5 months, even getting into 6 months. That's a long time to wait if you're very sick. But the major benefit is, of course, that it's widely available. It is pretty affordable, and my understanding is it the most powerful immunomodulator of the worms?
So some of the people who are working with a lot of patients think that is the most powerful modulator. And let me be clear, there's not a lot of people that work with individuals doing the TSO or the HDC and the
Mm-hmm.
hookworms. You've got a lot
Mm-hmm.
of people working with hookworm, and then separately you've got a lot of people working with the
Yeah.
TSO or the HDC, usually not both.
Mm-hmm. So it's
So
hard to
it
compare
might
the
be the most
species.
powerful, and it
Mm-hmm.
certainly has the most adverse side effects. So
Mm-hmm.
that's, whereas the TSO and the HTC will basically give you a laxative effect that's very temporary.
Yeah.
The Yeah, the NA can cause long, prolonged
Yeah.
gastrointestinal, that kind of thing.
Yeah. But usually that is only seen within the first 12 weeks of using NA. Is that right?
Uh, Usually, yeah, and there's a specific time right around six
Mm-hmm.
weeks, right, where
Mm-hmm.
extremely bad. So,
Hmm.
but it
Hmm.
can go. It depends on the dose, right? If you get
Yes.
way too many, it can last a long time. So,
Hmm. I know me personally, I started with 8 NAs, which was not my intention. It's a long story, but I started with 8 and I didn't notice any changes at all, zero. But I also was experiencing constant pain, diarrhea, gastro symptoms, even brain fog. So who really knows if I had any sort of worm flu symptoms?
yeah, that's one of the things that we've noted is that people who are very, just in great pain from inflammatory bowel disease, their threshold for a side effect is going to be much lower
Mm,
than the average person.
mm,
So yeah, that's something
mm-hmm.
to keep in mind.
Sure. So on to my next question, which we have touched on a little bit, but just maybe to get a concise list, which diseases are likely to be helped by helminthic therapy, or which diseases have you seen helped by this therapy?
Right. There's basically four classes of disease that people think about with this therapy. There's allergic disorders, there's autoimmune conditions,
Mm-hmm.
there's digestive problems, and then there's neuropsychiatric.
Mm.
So
And
the
three of the four.
neuropsychiatric, I mean, chronic inflammation, it's all the same, right? And it's probably all tied to the gut, and a lot of it has to do
Yeah.
with the microbiota. So it looks
Mm-hmm.
like that that with the autoimmune disease, it really depends on how far it's progressed and how it's progressing. If things are waxing and waning, and even
Yeah.
with allergies, there's some indication of that. So seasonal
Mm-hmm.
allergies, the therapy tends to work very well as far as we can tell. And again, no, we haven't got the placebo-controlled trials. This
Mm-hmm.
is all from collecting information from people who are using the therapy or people who've
Mm-hmm.
tried it and it failed,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's good for seasonal allergies with ragweed pollen, but it's not good, say, if you've got mold in your house. Then apparently it just
Interesting.
doesn't do, or if you've got a cat that you live
Mm-hmm.
with, it probably
Mm-hmm.
won't do any good. Whereas if you're infrequently exposed to a cat, it can be helpful.
Oh, that's
Um,
interesting. Interesting. So with allergies, exposure frequency matters as well.
yeah, yeah. If you're living with it, the helminths don't seem to do a lot of good. We've had some. I'm aware of one case in particular, which, the person had a lifelong sensitivity to peanuts, and it didn't go away, but
Mm,
it's a lot less. And
yeah.
if they suddenly started eating a whole peanut butter sandwich every day, I think they would
Mm-hmm.
be in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're
Mm-hmm.
accidentally exposed to a bit of it, then they're in much less trouble than they were before.
I've heard that with celiac disease as well. People using helminths for celiac is that they still tend to eat gluten free, but if they are exposed to gluten, they don't have as bad of a reaction. If there's any sort of cross contamination, it's not this big reaction anymore. It's just they just still choose not to eat gluten for health benefits, but it's better than it was essentially.
Right. And same with peanuts. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Same, exactly, same story. So you're talking food sensitivities. And then I think the thing that surprised us, and this is the thing that my group really got out there in the scientific literature was, hey, this works really well for major depressive disorders, especially as a women's
Mm,
health issue,
mm,
postmenopausal women, a lot of anxiety
interesting.
disorders, major depressive disorder, and mental fog. It works great. And let's see, the chronic fatigue, it tends to work really well for that too, just
Mm,
remarkably well. And our experience is mostly with the HDC on that.
yeah.
So can't, and I have been told that the hookworm will do that. We just don't have
Mm-hmm.
we didn't collect most people doing the hookworm are trying to treat something else, for example, inflammatory bowel disease.
Yeah. Yeah. That make it, which does make more sense because, like you said, people who have more extreme chronic conditions may be more willing to take take a risk, like taking NA.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question, and probably the most common question that I get asked, is how do we select the correct species of helminth? I know this is such a can be kind of a vague question, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this.
Well,
And I know
we've talked
the
about
ideal world situation is going to come up, I think.
right. So yeah, if the in an ideal world, right, you want to have access to all of them, and then
Yeah.
you could just start out with, say, the HDC
Hmm.
because you have access. But
Hmm.
and you need that. maybe starting out once every 5 or 6 weeks, but then it's probably going to increase in frequency as your body adjusts, where you need it every week. And
Mm,
if that works, then you're done. But because
hmm.
the side effects are so low, but
Yeah.
then if that doesn't work, maybe you need to add on. So that's
Hmm.
a flatworm. So then maybe you need to add a roundworm, which could
Hmm.
be the whipworm or the Necator americanus, the hookworm, right? And so just use things in combination and try to see how that works in an ideal world. But for most
Hmm.
people, it's going to be
Hmm.
a matter of A, what can I afford? And B, what
Hmm.
do I have access
Hmm. Totally. And that was the biggest factors that I considered when I started the therapy. Obviously, there's really only two species available here in Australia. And the reason that I started with NA was because I was apprehensive, to be honest, about committing so much financially to a therapy that I wasn't really sure was going to help me. So I felt safer committing the smaller amount of costs for the NA. But
to?
in
Yeah, and
hindsight, I didn't really think it through. I should have done it differently, but that was my reasoning.
I mean it's reasonable. Your reasoning is
Hmm.
reasonable. And,
Hmm.
the bottom line is with the NA, if you get an adverse reaction, if you take too much, you can easily get rid of it.
Yeah.
You need to talk to a doctor, and they'll give you the appropriate medication, and it'll be
Hmm.
gone quickly.
Hmm. Hmm. So
Not that,
basically,
and I should. Oh, go ahead.
no, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say I should hasten to point out that I can't encourage anyone to ever try this. I can just give people information about this
Yeah.
is what we know about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're
Yeah.
not giving medical advice.
Yeah.
None of that. We'll get in trouble for that here in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. We should have started with that. This is definitely not medical advice. It's just talking about the research that you've been involved in and what you've seen, essentially. So basically, what you're saying is that in an ideal world, we would all start with HDC because it's the least likely to cause, or because it's the most likely to work the quickest, correct? So we can see if
Well,
the helminths
again, hypothetically, we're saying,
hypothetically.
we're not advising people to do this, but yeah, in an
Yeah.
ideal world, everything was approved and it was
Yeah.
all available, then yeah, this would be the advice that someone would get
Yeah.
is that yeah, use this sort of the helminth light, the HDC I've heard it called, and
Hmm.
then work your way up if you need to.
Hmm. 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 Which does make sense. Yeah. Unfortunately, that isn't really how the therapy is done in practice, as you know.
No,
As you know.
no.
Um, so the next question that I have is the of the three species that are mainly used, have you seen a range of dosing for each of those species that does seem to be good without being too much, essentially? The safe
So
range.
the answer is yes, we have a range, and B, it really depends on the individual.
Yeah.
So if you look at the TSO, it can range from 30 to say a 7,000 a week. I mean, that's a huge range,
Yeah, wow, it's
right?
huge.
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. And if you look at the HDC, that can range from about 3 to 300 a week. So you're looking at these big ranges for both those organisms. The hookworm, most people can't go very high on a hookworm, right? If you get up
Yeah.
to 50 on a hookworm, that is really, really high. And then some people are down to only one or two.
Hmm.
So the range with a hookworm, just because the kickback on that one is pretty substantial.
Yeah.
Um,
You definitely don't want to take too many hookworms, for sure. Hmm. No. Okay, so obviously the range varies a lot depending on the person, how sick they are when they start potentially.
well,
And
so we can't. Yeah, let's talk about that. So we can't tell. There's some exceptions, but for the most part, we can't tell ahead of time who's going to be going up higher and higher on their dose and who's just going to stop
mm,
early on. I mean, maybe small children who have a lot of immune problems have to stay low, and maybe say women with more neuropsychiatric issues have to go higher, maybe, but
mm-hmm,
that's not a solid rule. And then for
mm,
everyone else, it's just you start low if you can, and again, you can't do this with the hookworm necessarily. You start low and just go high and see where your dose lands. And the other thing to think about is that it tends to change over time. So
interesting.
that when you start out, you don't need as many as say a couple of years later after your body's adjusted to it. Then
I have wondered
then you
about
might.
that actually. Like even just from my own personal experience, I have a set dose. I take 20 NA and 2,500 TSO. And yeah, is my dose going to have to increase as I get older, as my body becomes more used to the worms being there?
Yeah, if you think of it as like exercise, it makes sense, right? Because
Hmm. Hmm.
if you never exercise at all, it might give you a really good workout just to walk a couple of blocks. But then if you as you get more and more exercise, and you just
Yeah.
walking a couple of blocks really probably won't do that much.
Hmm. The exercise analogy is actually quite useful when talking about elements. It's like a workout for your immune system, essentially.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So, we have touched on this, and you might not actually be able to even give a definitive answer, as we've seen is hard to do for a lot of these questions, essentially. But in your experience or what you've seen, how long does each species take to work to show benefits?
That's again, it's
Mm,
highly, highly variable depending on the individual. The HDC does tend to be faster than the TSO,
mm-hmm,
and the hookworm can take quite a bit longer. That could take up to months. But even I'm told that even the HDC can take months sometimes to kick in.
mm-hmm,
So it's gonna
mm-hmm.
it's gonna be highly variable. Now, the way that we do the that's I should be careful what the way I say this. The way that
Yeah.
we've seen people do the HDC, not that
Mm-hmm,
we would encourage anybody to ever do anything, but
mm-hmm,
is
mm-hmm.
that if if people start low and work their way up, they'll within a couple of months they can find a dose that's that's reasonable for them based
Yeah.
on all the reports.
I've seen in the Facebook group and on the wiki, obviously they say that you need to wait 2 years to see full and consistent benefits from helminths. Now, is that just in regards to NA, or is that for all of the species, do you think?
Well, I think from my understanding, that is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the outside case, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you've tried it for 2 years and nothing has happened, then nothing's going to happen. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
most people will see results a lot sooner than that with any of these organisms.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I saw benefits around 5 months. And the people that I spoke to who had inflammatory bowel disease and had a similar story to me starting with NA, they also said that by their third dose, which is month 6, they were starting to see the first changes, which is pretty much what happened to me. So, I think that kind of answers that question. It is kind of difficult to say, essentially. HTC maybe works fastest, but maybe not in all cases. TSO is somewhere in the middle, and NA possibly takes the longest. But
Yeah,
again, it's
I
super
think that's
individual.
yeah, that's kind of the general yeah, just sort of a general guideline.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and again, no, if we run when we run the clinical trials, which is what we hope to do,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I would be curious if we're ever going to find the answers to these questions, because once we find something that works really well, maybe we'll just stick with it.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Essentially, I think what I see with a lot of self-treaters is there's a lot of comparing between species, but then in the research, it's not really about comparing the species. It's just about finding something that works and going with it. Is that right?
Yeah, you are correct. Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
That is interesting. I really see a lot of people who are just learning about the therapy become really obsessed with thinking about which species to choose. And I think that it's not misguided. Of course, it's important, but it's maybe the most important thing is to make sure that you understand the therapy, I think, understand it fully for sure.
right. Yeah, and I mean, for a lot of people, as you said earlier, you're not going to have much choice because there's limited options available.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Totally. And essentially, even with only 4 options available, that's still pretty limited, especially with TTO pretty much off the table, HCC off the table for many people around the world. There isn't that much choice, right?
yeah, there's not.
No, no. So the next question that I have, question number 9, is what are the major obstacles facing helminthic therapy right now? And this is something I know that you have a lot of important things to say because it has a lot to do with the research.
Right. This is something we've been thinking about and working on, and other people have too. So there's no
Mm-hmm.
question about that. One of the big obstacles is the amount of money that it takes to run a clinical trial and the fact that it's very difficult to patent one of
Mm,
these worms. I mean, you can keep your production process secret, which is essentially what's done with the TSO, but
mm-hmm.
from what we can tell looking at the literature, they keep changing the method. We can
Mm,
confirm that they keep changing the method, even though we don't know what it is. We know that some component, if not all the components, have changed dramatically over time, and that may affect how the organisms work. So there's drawbacks to that, and
You're talking about TSO clinical trials, sorry, that the researchers used different methods to make the TSO, and that affected the
right.
results of clinical trials.
Well, so that's just we don't know. It's not
Yeah.
science. Yeah, science is supposed to work where you got, a reproducible procedure
Hmm.
and you run that procedure and you see what results you get, and you
Yeah.
get the same results each time. But with the TSO, since the manufacturing process is basically unknown, and since we
Hmm.
do know that they being people running the tests are changing the protocol on
Yeah.
a regular basis, just on the scant methods that are published,
Hmm.
then we can't say whether or not it's the methods or not. We believe it is based on some information that we have
Yeah.
comparing results clinical trials with people that are self-treating.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
that's the bottom line. But the other issue is that when you run a clinical trial, if you run it and pick a single dose and just try that on everybody, based on everything we've been talking about, that's potentially a problem.
Yeah.
And not just almost certainly is a problem. So that's
Yeah.
that's one of the issues. So you got all this money around these clinical trials, and then when you finally get it into the clinical trial, even though it's hard to get money to do it because you can't patent a worm,
Yeah.
then it
Yeah.
doesn't seem to be reproducible, and the methods that are being used aren't what we would think needs to be used. And like I said, since 1968, we've kind of known what this problem is,
Yeah.
and we should be able to nail this down, but we just it hasn't been done. And we
It's
can cure
expensive.
laboratory animals. We're really good at that, but
Yeah.
people haven't gotten to that.
Yeah. So, um, wait, like my understanding is the major concern with the clinical trials is that ultimately, if a company was to invest in a helminth, at the end, it's difficult to make something that is marketable and profitable at the end. And that's because you said live helminths can't be um, trademarked. Oh, I forgot the word. Is
Right?
that
Yeah, you can't patent
yeah,
an organism that's just running around free. So
yeah.
and this has been known for a long time. We're not the first ones to point this out. It's just difficult. Our view right now is that, like, if you've got a government that does the science, and then we assume that when science gets an answer, that
Mm-hmm.
industry will take over. Well, that is not always the case.
Yeah,
So then it falls back on the government to get this thing to the point where it does look attractive to industry, or just you know, make it something that
available.
the government does. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, which is maybe not going to happen.
Well,
um,
we'll see.
yeah, yeah, we'll see. Yeah, for sure. Um, I think it's interesting. Um, People don't really think about how clinical trials really work and how they happen. I think people just think, oh, if if this works so well, why don't we see it in the pharmacy? And it's because huge monetary investment into clinical trials. It's difficult to make a profit from a live species because you can't patent it. And ultimately, some of the clinical trials that have been done may or may not have been done incorrectly, but have given inconsistent results. That's essentially the major obstacles?
Summed it up beautifully.
Awesome. I didn't even take notes. um, I mean, the I guess the follow-up question would be how do we get over those obstacles? Like if helminths are live species and they can never be patented, how could this therapy ever be widely available to people?
Well, we like to think of it as sort of the yogurt model, right? If the government can get this to the point where I can just walk into the grocery store and say, "Hey, I'd like a probiotic," or in this case,
Yeah.
I would like this, and then
Mm-hmm.
it'll have some name to it that's marketable and then people appreciate. And
Yeah.
then if I could just buy it at the grocery store, then I'm okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it pays, people can. But if you've got to pay $110 million or $200 million to get it through clinical trials,
Yeah.
then selling yogurt is not going to pay for it, right?
No, no, it has to be a medical a remedy essentially. How much does it cost, just for interest, like how much does it cost to run a clinical trial?
So it depends a lot on what you run the clinical trial for.
Yeah.
So if you run it for neuropsychiatric disorders, it's much different than if you run it for inflammatory bowel disease, which is much different than if you run it for, say, Parkinson's or something, these kind of chronic neurodegenerative degenerative issues.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
but it can run. It usually runs over $100 million when you talk about phase one, two, and three together. And
Wow.
can get up in the neighborhood of $500 million with all the marketing that has to be done for the drug.
How can the worms ever pay for that? That is so much
Right. Well,
money.
like I said, I think, well, worms. So I think it can happen. I believe it can happen. We'll just say
That's
that. I won't
awesome.
say I think. I believe it
Hmm.
can happen
Hmm.
because there's no other way to fix these issues, right? You've got
Mm.
to deal with the underlying cause of disease. If you keep
Mm.
using
It's the
drugs
way.
to, yeah, block
Hmm.
specific points in the immune system, you're not ever going to get the same effect, and you're always going
Mm.
to have a kickback. So I think
Mm.
we have to do it this way. The question is how to do it this way. And for
Hmm.
that, as I said, I think if the government gets to the point where we being the scientists and the government all working together develop something
Hmm.
that we take it all the way through these trials and say, okay, this works, this is what it works for, have at it, produce it all you want, and hand it over to industry, then it should be okay because they don't have to earn that $500 million or 100 million or
Yeah.
whatever it's going to be,
Yeah.
right? The government usher it through.
Yeah. I mean, I also believe that if there's enough self-treaters, enough people who are using this therapy successfully, surely it can't continue to be ignored or disregarded. Like if enough people are using it in practice, eventually it surely would have to be accepted and researched and looked into more seriously, you know? Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, I work on another project dealing with the causes of autism spectrum
Mm-hmm.
disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And in that project, we do a lot of work about awareness
Mm-hmm.
and marketing. And then I have people on my team that know about these kinds of tipping points and early
Yeah.
adopters and late adopters and when it reaches. And so I I know that in principle you are correct, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't know how many people that would take.
Yeah.
It, tipping points are hard to predict. It could just be one person who's very, very well known that has a
Mm-hmm.
certain illness and
Mm-hmm.
helmets fix it. That could be it, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only celebrity I know with Crohn's disease is Pete Davidson. He's on an SNL celebrity, and I could send him, and I could send the information to him, maybe get him on board.
Well, so and Crohn's and ulcerative colitis are not the best ones to look at because
Yeah.
you know it can take a long time for those, and I think a lot of that has to do with the microbiota. So
Hmm.
if the microbiota and the immune system and the helmets all form kind of a single unit, if you
Interesting.
will, in the human body. So
Hmm.
you've got three legs on that
Hmm.
thing, and if
Hmm.
you only fix one of them, and you're hoping the immune
Hmm.
system will come around, but you haven't dealt with that other one, the microbiota, that could be difficult. Whereas it just doesn't seem to be that much of a problem with the seasonal allergies or the relapsing remitting autoimmune diseases or the neuropsychiatric disorders.
It's really interesting that you said that, and I wonder from my own experience because I've had pretty good success with helminths, and I was really sick before. I had very severe fistulizing Crohn's disease, and I have wondered if I know my microbiome was completely depleted before from previous antibiotic use and just essentially from not being able to eat any fruits or vegetables pretty much for years, you know? That's obviously going to decrease your gut biome diversity. But I have wondered if part of the reason that I've had such good success with the therapy is because I eat very healthy. I eat for my microbiome. I eat fermented foods every single day. I drink kombucha. I eat at least 5 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables every single day. And I have wondered if that's part of the reason why I've had such good success because at the same time I was reintroducing the helminths, once I was able to eat food again, thanks to the helminths, I immediately started eating prebiotic foods because I know my gut biome is just basically destroyed from being sick for so long.
Yeah, that's part of the difficulties with the clinical trials with the inflammatory bowel disease is if it's,
Mm,
say you got two
mm,
leaks in your boat, right? And you can only
mm.
fix one in a clinical trial, right? The people either do a
Yes.
clinical trial on the microbiota or they do a clinical trial on the helminths, but not both.
Mm,
That's one of
mm.
the,
That's so
that's an
interesting.
issue. Yeah, yeah. And then we don't even deal with the other kinds of things that the chronic psychological stress is really bad for digestion, and
Mm,
in that clinic, and low vitamin D levels. So you've
yeah.
got these, we call them environmental mismatches, and
Mm,
there's five and that are common across all high income countries, and then six, which is toxin exposures. So from all kinds of things, that can vary from culture to culture. So we
mm.
typically only deal with one of those at a time, which is not a smart way to do things, but it's a scientific way.
Which are the five environmental mismatches, if you don't mind?
Sure, it's chronic psychological stress,
Yeah.
right? It is, yep, inflammatory diet, sedentary lifestyle, low vitamin D deficiency,
Hmm.
and let's see, and the one we've been talking about, the missing helmets.
Yeah. Yeah. So essentially, if you only solve one of those mismatches, you're still maybe mismatched in four other areas that can be contributing to a chronic disease, essentially.
That is 100% correct. Yes, ma'am.
Interesting, because I think that people can look at Hellman's and go, "Ooh, it's a fix all, it's a fix all." But essentially, if you're still eating a pro-inflammatory diet, you're still laying on your couch and working inside, you're not getting vitamin D, you may still have chronic inflammatory issues, right?
Yeah, and especially with chronic stress, in
Yeah.
the U.S., if you're watching the news for 2 hours a day,
Hmm.
you're gonna be in. I mean, that's just a problem,
It's
right?
upsetting, the news. Yeah. Interesting. I think stress is definitely something that needs to be more researched. I know that most people with IBD know that stress is a huge trigger for them. I do personally. Even with the helminths, I can still tell when I'm stressed, my stomach is I don't feel as great, even still with the helminths. So it's still a contributing factor to how I feel, for sure.
Yeah, there's a great book called the title is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Great
Okay.
book.
I'm gonna write it
Our
down.
bodies, our bodies produce stress naturally, but it's the reason why we do it is to get us to do something, to get out of the situation, to
Mm,
alleviate the problem.
mm-hmm.
And we're in a society now where that's not always possible. So it goes back to the question of hygiene. Do we have too much hygiene? No, we have how much we need, but we need to
Mm.
sort of compensate for the kickback on that. So the same thing, we don't need to have to run away from a bear that's chasing us. We don't
Yeah.
want that.
Yeah.
But because we don't have to do that, then we need to compensate that for that by going to the gym or doing something else
Yeah.
to alleviate
Yeah.
stress. Yeah.
Exactly. Instead of walking to find food, we now have to go and walk on a treadmill after work, right?
Right.
Awesome. So I think that leads us to our final last 10th question, which is what can you tell us about the future of about future trials, about future research, and about the future of helminths?
Well, I think we know how to do a trial that will demonstrate what we have found to be the effectiveness of a helmet. And
Mm-hmm.
so we know how to do it. The question
Mm-hmm.
is just getting the resources to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I am very hopeful. And
Mm-hmm.
people that are aware of the politics in the United States may
Mm-hmm.
know that there are individuals now who are very, very interested
Mm-hmm.
in dealing with underlying causes of chronic disease, which
Mm-hmm.
is that is nail on the head. It's exactly
Yeah.
what
That's what's missing.
reconstituting the bio. Yeah,
Yeah.
this will do it. So,
Yeah.
and, I think we should have learned from the fecal transplant fiasco, which was, that's discovered in 1958, and it took us what 70 years to really put it in play, even though
Yeah.
tens of thousands of people are dying each year
You're talking about
from
from C.
recurrent.
diff. Yeah.
Yep,
Right. Yeah.
recurrent. Yeah, so that's a great example of where science figured out the answer, but then there was no industry to take it forward.
Mm.
So hopefully we've learned from that, and again, we do know how to fix the problem. I believe we just need to actually do it. And and people say, well, you haven't proven it with a clinical trial, and that's absolutely correct. But
Mm.
I mean, when you've collected over 1,000 case reports,
Yeah.
of things that
That
work
has
and
to mean
don't work.
something. Yeah. Yeah.
It does. It means a lot, and the p values are really good. We know that For example, with the neuropsychiatric stuff, it works so much better than modern pharmaceuticals that
Yeah.
it, P values are off the charts. Which of the probability that we're just seeing random chance is off the charts. That's when
Yeah.
a scientist says the P values are really good. That means they're super small. It means it didn't happen by chance. So
Hmm.
we just need the opportunity to put it into play.
If there was clinical trials done in the future, which of the worms do you think they would be looking into?
Well, so if I was doing them, of course it would be the HDC, and then
Hmm.
other people have tried. Now we haven't mentioned, but some people have tried hookworm,
No,
right? And then
NA.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, and those have been, they've given some shaky results, but again, it's one dose or two
Hmm.
doses,
It's not
and
enough.
it's the exact same dose, so you're not ramping up, you're not doing the kinds of things that self-treaters know that are most effective.
Yeah.
And of course, we're not. Our goal is not to get more people self-treating. From my perspective,
Hmm.
is,
Hmm.
and the reason why we did all our studies to learn everything we can from these thousands of people that are self-treating, and then apply that in the clinical trials. And that's the whole
Yeah.
reason we did our research, and that is what has not been done yet.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. So essentially, you're using the information, some of the information from self-treaters to decide how to run the clinical trials successfully, because some clinical trials have not been done successfully into helminths, and we want to avoid that happening again in the future.
Right. We really like, and part of it is just starting with the right indicate or the right reason. Inflammatory bowel disease may not be the best one to start out with, especially with the issues we talked about, the
Yeah.
microbiota.
Yeah.
And in a clinical trial, you can only deal with one thing at a time, really.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So which, or do you know of any clinical trials that are potentially going to happen in the future? Is anything in the works, or are you not sure?
Well, so the rumor on the street is that some more trials with TSO have been done. I know there's a company, and that
Okay.
information is on the web, that has the resources to try one. However, I'm not sure that they did anything differently than
Mm.
what has been done before. So
So they would have got similar results.
that would be a guess, but and hopefully I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll have to wait to see if the paper and when the paper does come out to read the results. Eh? Excellent. Well, I think that pretty much sums up the 10 questions that I have. Is there anything else you feel that needs to be said, or anything else you want to add, or you think we've covered everything?
I think that's the all the major issues have been covered. I mean, from
Hmm.
my perspective, of course, we
Hmm.
can't. Nothing is approved. Nothing has been
Yeah.
tested through what we would consider, and my self-treatment studies don't count as
Mm-hmm.
evidence that's sufficient to really tell people what to do. So that's where we need to go. And until we get there, then people are left struggling with this issue that you mentioned early on. What's the potential cost and benefit of
Yeah.
this? And everybody sort of has to figure it out on their own, which is
Hmm.
that's not really how we like to do
Hmm.
medicine. We really want to get those trials run so that we then can make official recommendations and say, okay, this is what it's going to work.
Mm.
These are your chances of it working, and these are the drawbacks. And just like any other drug,
Yeah.
you can say this is what we know based on these clinical trials. That's what we're shooting
Mm.
for.
Mm. Mm. Okay. Excellent. Well, I'm really happy with all the answers and the information that we got. I learned quite a bit. I'm sure other people listening will have as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Parker, for donating your time and answering all of the questions. And thanks for all your involvement in the therapy. Really appreciate all the research and efforts that you put into obviously the benefits that I've seen, but also the information that you provided for the community, the self-treating community in general. So thank you very much. And thanks again for your
Thank you.
time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much. See you. Bye.
All right. Bye bye.